Friends, welcome to Homicide, Assault, and Intimate Partner and Family Violence. And let's see just how many typos we can find today. So homicide is the killing of one human being by another, okay? Not all homicides are criminal. There are homicides that are justifiable. So think about a soldier during war, self-defense, police officer under certain circumstances. And so in a way, your textbook has this definition wrong because it's not causing the death of another person without legal justification or excuse. It's the death of one human being caused by the death of another human being. When there is no legal justification or excuse, then it becomes murder or manslaughter. Murder can have various degrees of murder, okay? Murder requires malice aforethought. Now, that doesn't have to mean you were planning for a long time, that it's premeditated and that there's forethought to it. You can form premeditation like that, according to the courts. Okay? Now, first-degree murder, it's the most serious kind, willful, deliberate, and premeditated, whereas second degree is intentional and unlawful. So these are like crimes of passion. You probably heard these examples of like a man comes home, he finds his wife in bed with another man and he shoots her or he shoots the other man. That's often second degree murder. Then there's manslaughter, right? So again, lesser degree of culpability here. Negligent manslaughter is an involuntary manslaughter, okay? And actually that's generally what you're charged with is involuntary versus voluntary manslaughter. Okay, involuntary manslaughter is often something like a motor vehicle homicide when someone's been under the influence. And then a voluntary manslaughter, non-negligent manslaughter has the absence of malice aforethought. Now, people who kill someone usually have a history of assaultive behavior. And that's our next crime, aggravated assault. Now, the terms assault and battery get kind of thrown around, and they do each have their own specific definition, but those definitions don't necessarily match the law. So technically, a battery is an unwanted physical touching of another person, okay? Whereas assault is the attempt to commit a battery and the ability to carry that out, okay? But we charge people with assault when they actually touch somebody. So this is the intentional infliction of bodily injury on another person or the attempt to do so. So like an assault could be like you swung but you missed. Okay. Now there's various degrees of this as well. And a simple assault generally doesn't involve a weapon and generally does not produce any kind of serious injury. Okay. Then we have aggravated assault, which does cause injury and is often accompanied by the use of a weapon or a dangerous or deadly weapon. And the definitions of what constitutes like deadly and dangerous weapons is actually fairly surprising. I think most people tend to think, oh, that must be like a knife or a gun. Your hands can be a deadly weapon. If you attack somebody with steel-toe boots, that's a deadly weapon. If you're a trained boxer, your hands are a deadly weapon. Now, thinking about demographics and victimization, African Americans are disproportionately represented in arrest and conviction data. So they account for 13% of the population, but over half of homicide arrests. And their rate of arrest for their homicide rate is 8 times higher than that of white people. Most murders are intra-racial, okay? So like white on white, black on black. Like inter means like opposite, right? Intra means within. Their victimization rate is also significantly higher than that of white folks, okay? Now, as far as gender goes, men are about 80% of victims for homicides and assaults here, but 90% of arrests for murder. As far as age goes, about half of everybody who's arrested for a violent crime are between 20 and 29, okay? So violence, crime in general, but violence specifically is like a young person's game. Okay, it's about a third of murder victims are young, and half of offenders are under 25. Poverty, we know, is correlated with all kinds of risk factors that have to do with violence and all kinds of criminal offending. So children are at higher risk for violence if they grow up in poverty. Now, most homicides are going to start from interpersonal arguments. And there's this whole theory, explanation, whatever, that talks about how an interpersonal argument can escalate into a homicide. So, I bump into you somewhere, you think I did it on purpose, we exchange words back and forth, we do that thing where we're like, what? Hit me. Okay. Maybe one of us lifts up like the bottom of our shirt and brandishes a weapon, and now people can't back down. Okay. So the accessibility of guns facilitates murder. Obviously, it's much easier to kill somebody with a gun. Now, we could kill somebody with anything. Okay. We could kill people with our bare hands. We could kill people with a pen. I grew up in Everett when my brothers, who are 42, 41, when they were in kindergarten, there was two little boys in their class, and their mother had been stabbed to death 150 times with a pen by her boyfriend. Okay. There's a well-known pedophile priest that was killed in prison here in Massachusetts. They jammed, the person who killed him, jammed open his cell with a toothbrush and then strangled him to death with a tube sock. So you can kill people with anything, right? But guns make it much easier. Knives, not as easy as guns, but also easier, right? So in places that have higher levels of gun ownership, we have higher levels of homicide. Okay, so about 70% of homicides involve a gun. Knives are used less than 12% of the time. That's because a knife wound is easier to treat. I also have to get very close to you to hurt you or kill you with a knife. Okay, and it's much easier if you have time to get to the hospital for that sort of damage to be repaired. Now, one of the things with guns is not only is it difficult, obviously, to do bullets do more damage, right? But there are some types of bullets that are specifically trained so that when they go into your body or into whatever, they like spread out and they shred. Okay, so this is what happens with a lot of the semi-automatic weapons we see that are used in mass shootings, is that it's impossible for physicians to repair the damage because of how the organs get shredded. Every 14 minutes in America, someone dies from a gunshot wound. That does include deaths by suicide. And I think we talked before about the weapons effect. The fact that a weapon is present increases the likelihood of something escalating. Now, New Jersey did this. A lot of the departments of corrections might have research arms. Massachusetts does. And they actually do quite a bit of research. And the Massachusetts Bridgewater State Hospital, not the university, is where involuntary commitments go. And that's where the sex offenders go. Not all the sex offenders who are like committed go there. And they've done a lot of research on sex offending and treatment for sex offenders. So in New Jersey, they have a typology where they use it to classify homicides based on like motivation or other behavioral patterns. Okay, so one is offenders who commit a homicide precipitated by a general altercation or argument. Those are the ones we were just talking about. An argument escalates out of control. Okay, it often comes from that like tit for tat back and forth where people are escalating something that often started out small. Now, there's offenders who commit a homicide in the course of committing a felony. So they're committing some other kind of felony. They're robbing a bank. Robbing a bank's our best example. Okay. Committing a burglary, grand theft, kidnapping somebody. And somebody is killed in that process. Even if you are not the person who pulled the trigger, but you're involved in that crime, you can be found guilty of felony murder. Okay. So felony murder is a murder committed in the course of committing a felony. There's DV-related homicides, right? These are current or former. Let me clarify something. It's probably coming up in a future slide. But when we think about domestic violence, there's two terms that get used. One is domestic violence and one is intimate partner violence. They're similar, but a little bit different, okay? So domestic violence has to do with who lives in your home, okay? So domestic violence could be children against parents, parents against children, siblings against each other. It is often intimate partners, okay? Intimate partners, though, are people who've had an intimate relationship. I don't mean intimate like you tell your bestie your stories, right? You've had some sort of like sexual relationship. That includes people you're no longer in a relationship with. So like if an ex hurt you, that would be considered an intimate partner homicide if an ex-partner killed you, okay? Some places include roommates in domestic violence. So like if you and your roommate come to fisticuffs and somebody gets hurt, in some places that gets charged as domestic violence. And then there's homicides that have to do with like somebody got killed in an accident, generally involving a car. So as we mentioned, most homicides are going to be the result of hostile aggression, okay? It could be reactive violence. There's an emotionally charged situation and someone has acted quickly for the purpose of harming someone that they think is like provoking them or starting stuff with them. Okay? Hostile attribution bias says that violence is promoted whenever someone perceives provocations or threats, right? You know, some people just have like what we call a hair trigger, right? It does not take much and they go from 0 to 60. They don't have good self-regulation. They don't have the ability to control and alter their own behavior. You might have some friends like this. And then there's emotional arousal. So this is a state of excitement and readiness for action, okay? When we're in this type of, when we're emotionally aroused, right, our cognitive abilities decrease, okay? And we often act before we think. I already told you about a felony homicide, right? Okay. Juveniles sometimes commit homicides as well. Okay. There's a pretty well-known case out of Rhode Island when I was in college last century. There's a guy named Craig Price. He was 15 years old, 9 months and something, like days or weeks away from being 16. And he murdered somebody. Can't remember if it was more than one person. And so he could not be tried as an adult under the law in Rhode Island at the time. Okay. Now, juveniles can be held until they're 21, which is what happened. And when he was 21, he was being released, which was happening when I was in college. So it was all over the news about how people were pissed. Keep him in. Don't let him out. Except that, like, that's not a choice. They have to let him out. Surprise, surprise. He did not reform himself. Okay, so there are juveniles who commit homicides. Again, usually arises out of an altercation. Okay, so a little under 10% of homicide offenders that are arrested are minors. Okay, now there's some differences as to like what's the victim-offender relationship based on gender. So girls are more likely to kill family members. They're more likely to kill younger people, women, intimate partners, and their offspring. Girls are 9 times more likely to kill intimate, that should say partners, not parents. 4 times more likely to kill children under 5 and twice as likely to kill family members or other women. Okay. They're also more likely to use knives or other weapons. So they're less likely to use guns. Now, as far as like what's the psychological makeup of juvenile murderers, this is a small group of offenders, okay? And when we have a small group, it means we can't necessarily determine statistically significant relationships. There's not enough to study, okay? Now, it's a bummer for research, but it's good that we don't have enough to study, okay? So usually it's coming from small samples. They're usually in a treatment setting. They don't necessarily become killers as a result of psychosis or serious mental illness. They do have, a large percent of them have learning disabilities or have failed at least one grade. And this is common with kids that are in the juvenile justice system in general, that many of them, I worked with a lot of teenage boys who were like 17 and on their 3rd try at 9th grade. They often come from homes where there's not a lot of parental supervision, a lot of family abuse. It's possible that they have some neurological issues. We talked about all these biological traits and personality and individual traits that long-term chronic offenders have. Look at how many of them have a conduct disorder, right? Almost all of them. ADHD is fairly common. So they've just got like risk factor upon risk factor upon risk factor. So what do we do with a juvenile who kills? Most of the time they're tried as an adult, although not always. They're going to initially go to a juvenile facility, especially if they're tried as a juvenile. Juveniles do have a constitutional right to treatment. If you're older adolescent and you have been tried as an adult, you may end up in an adult facility. Now, I mentioned intimate partner violence. Why are these in the same chapter? Well, they're closely connected, right? So this is physical, psychological, sexual violence perpetrated by people that are in a past or present intimate relationship. So as I mentioned, domestic means a person you live with. An intimate partner can be a current or former intimate partner. Okay? Now, about 20% of juveniles report being victims of physical and sexual abuse. About 60% report being victims of and perpetrators of psychological abuse. Now, this has been decreasing over time. 70s, really the 80s, we get a lot more awareness about domestic violence, about sexual abuse, about abuse against children. And so people intervene more. They don't really consider it like as much of a private matter as they did in the past. So amongst older adult, abusers tend to continue their patterns over long periods, okay? Even if their health is deteriorating, they tend to continue to engage in this behavior, although it might be a little less physical or a little less extreme. So the prevalence of it, of physical and sexual violence, declines, but the emotional abuse often does not, okay? And so the physical abuse may be replaced by psychological abuse, okay? Leaving a relationship in later life is complicated, right? First of all, leaving relationships are complicated. It's easy to look at these situations, right, and ask, why didn't she leave, okay? And that could be he or they, right? But we're often like, well, how come she didn't leave? Well, people don't show you this terrible side of themselves like on a first or second date, okay? Although there might be red flags. Generally, this is going to happen after you kind of already love somebody. And you don't stop loving somebody just because they start hurting you, okay? And it can be hard to leave. They're also very good at isolating you from your family and friends so that maybe when you want to leave, you feel like, who do you have and where can you go, okay? There are, abusers and perpetrators who will, maybe you are not documented, right? And they'll threaten to report you if you leave. They'll threaten to hurt your children. They'll threaten to hurt pets. Maybe you don't have access to money, right? You probably have had this experience in the last few years of being at a doctor's appointment, and they usually will ask you, do you feel safe in your own home? That question needs to be tweaked because I get asked that every time, and I live by myself. So I am safe in my own home. I am safe, period. But it's possible that I might be like, yeah, I'm safe in my own home, but maybe I'm not actually, maybe I'm in a relationship that's not safe. Okay. So we need to tweak that a little bit, but I know they ask, I know my niece has been asked that and she's a teenager. But a lot of facilities were not really screening older adults, assuming that like these things don't happen to them. Right. Now, Hispanic Latino folks have higher rates of intimate partner violence than white folks do. It's about double and a higher risk of being killed. I should note the most dangerous time for a victim of abuse is when they actually leave, okay? So when you leave, the perpetrator has lost control at this point, right? They don't have control over you anymore. You've left. You've gone to court. You've got a restraining order. You moved out. That can actually be the most dangerous time because now they have nothing left to lose. So there's nothing holding them back from escalating that violence. There was a story, I think it happened in Roslindale, where a woman had just taken her mother, a grown woman had just taken her mother to court, brought her to court, not like charged her with something. And they had just got a restraining order against mother's boyfriend. And he shot and killed her in the middle of a main road at like 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Amongst same-sex relationships, right? LGBTQ relationships, women in same-sex relationships were twice as likely to report verbal aggression, controlling behavior, physical aggression, and asexual aggression. We need more research on this. But again, if you think about anything, this is the thing. If your partner isn't out, right, this is a way you can control them. Okay, well, if you leave, I'm going to tell everybody that you're gay. Law enforcement and military families, a lot of domestic abuse prevalent here as well. Authoritarian jobs, high levels of stress. Now, in terms of offenders, right? Again, there's research on this. It doesn't matter quite as much that you guys understand like all these specific types, right? There's a lot of research on this just to kind of get the gist of it, right? So, this one batterer typology, and I apologize because I don't have the author written here, right? Breaks them down into family members only. Okay, this is the most common, less aggressive, more remorseful, low to moderate alcohol use. Abusive family members because of emotional problems. They're depressed. They have borderline personality, emotionally volatile, a lot of anger, perhaps psychopathology. Let me also be clear on that. Psychopathy that we talked about in a prior chapter is, the cruelty, the lack of empathy. Psychopathology just means mental illness. Okay. And then this third type that are generally violent towards family and people outside the family. So they're antisocial, criminally prone, serious violence towards their spouses. People who have an insecure attachment, that is correlated with domestic violence as well, right? If you think about it, that's going to have a lot of jealousy, low self-esteem, dependency on other people. And then alcohol and drug abuse exacerbate this, okay? So people do get drunk and beat their spouses, get in fights, get violent. Now, family violence is another broader term, right? So this could be within your family. It might not be people you live with. Any assault, intimidation, battery, sexual assault, sexual battery, any criminal offense that results in an injury against someone who's a family member or lives in your house, okay? As I mentioned, battering's the physical violence, although what you generally get charged with in court is going to be either assault and battery or assault. Okay. Now, part of the problem with research on these topics is the fact that we have different terms. Okay. So some people are looking at intimate partner violence. Some people are looking at domestic violence. Some people are studying family violence. This is why when we see research, we have to really think about and why it's important for all of you who have taken research methods and you think like, well, I'm not going to do research. Why do I need this? You need it to understand what the research is actually telling you. How did people get their numbers? Okay. Now, this is fairly common, unfortunately, but 1 in every 5 murders and non-negligent manslaughters in the U.S. involves a family member killing another family member, right? So when we're kids, we're taught all about stranger danger, mostly in regards to like being kidnapped or sexually assaulted. But you're actually in much more danger from people you already know and perhaps already trust. About half of these are spouses killing spouses. About 20% of all arrests for aggravated assault and 60% of simple assaults involve family members. Children under 12 are about 5% of victims of family aggravated assault and 4% of family simple assaults. I also want you to think about how much physical assault against children does not come to the attention of the police. So when we look at these numbers, a question we want to ask ourselves, if we think 5% feels low, right? We would want to be like, what's their sample? Who did they look at? Are they looking at police reports? Well, a lot of child abuse. I'm sure you all know someone who's been a victim of child abuse where nobody was arrested. The police were never involved. Okay, child abuse and neglect. About 1 in 7 children experience this. And parents and caretakers account for about 1/5 of all violent crimes committed against children. More than half are against children under 2. Every now and then there's a story in the news that's just absolutely vile that involves a very small child, and it's horrific, okay? Now, girls are 4 times as likely to be sexually abused as boys are. And there's a whole bunch of different surveys and research that have been done on this. These numbers are pretty consistent over time. Okay. So a little over 10% of American kids have been exposed to family violence in the past year, and about a quarter during their childhood. Now, about half are at the hands of siblings. Now, here's an area where we can get into some tricky stuff, right? Because I would bet everybody in this room, unless you're an only child, or not in this room, none of you are in this room with me. Everybody listening to this, everybody in our class, if you have a sibling, has put your hands on your siblings, and they've probably put their hands on you. You probably don't think of it as domestic violence, family violence, or child abuse, right? Most of us, I think, are thinking of a higher threshold for that, although certainly this could qualify. A lot of people also experience polyvictimization, so they have a lot of victimizations over the course of their development, and this is associated with health problems, school problems, etc. Also, in a lot of families where there is some child abuse occurring, there's abuse against pets. So one of the ways that you threaten or punish the child is to hurt a pet or threaten to hurt the pet. And we have just kind of a rundown of exactly what each of these types of abuse and neglect involve. Now, I'm sure you guys have all heard about kids that run away, right? And I don't mean you got mad at your mom and you packed a bag and you walked to your Nana's house. That's not really running away, right? We have a lot of kids who run away, and especially amongst girls that run away, but amongst boys as well. They're often running away from an abusive and unsafe home. They often haven't told anybody their home is abusive or unsafe. And so when they get picked up by authorities, what happens? They get returned to this unsafe home. Okay? There's also what's called throwaway children. This is basically involuntary runaways, sort of, right? These are parents or caretakers who've been like, get out of my house. Okay? This can happen when kids come out, if kids are non-binary. Parent just doesn't want to be bothered with you. Parent takes up with a romantic partner who doesn't want kids around. Now, abductions of children by strangers are rare. Okay? Most kidnapping is actually from a non-custodial parent or other family member known to the child. Okay? Abductions are rare, but most abductions, it's a person who knows the kid. So it's usually a parent who doesn't have custody. I had a client once, she'd been abducted twice, once by her mom, once by her dad, before she even ended up in our program. Then she was literally snatched by her mom while she was in our program. Okay? How does this happen? She's doing well enough in the program that she has some privileges. Her and her mom are on a visit. We let them go downstairs so that they can go to the vending machine and get a snack, and they don't come back. And she calls us from somewhere else at one point. She does not want to be with her mom. She wants someone to come and get her. That's what most kidnappings look like. Okay? When it is a stranger or a non-family member, the motivation is typically sexual. But stereotypically, abduction, a stereotypical stranger abduction is of a female victim who's sexually assaulted and killed, okay, between 6 and 14 years old. There's also other kinds of abuse against children. You guys are probably familiar with Munchausen syndrome because I would bet that you are all familiar with, oh my God, what's her name? She was on Dancing with the Stars. Joey King played her in like a series on TV. Oh my God, she was released from prison not that long ago. Oh my God, what's her name? Gypsy Rose. Gypsy Rose? Gypsy Rose. Okay. Munchausen syndrome by proxy. This is where people like hurt their child or create fake illnesses for their kid to get attention for themselves. Okay. It's most common when people are young, and that's what happened with Gypsy Rose. This is going to drive me nuts if it's not Gypsy. It is Gypsy. I just can't. Maybe it's not Rose. Okay. It's almost always the mother. Mother's usually very knowledgeable about medical issues. And you're going to start getting weird lab results. And the mortality rate for people who perpetrate this is between 6 and 10%. So like people die because of this. There's also other abusive behavior. So shaken baby syndrome was sort of like, I don't want to say all the rage because that sounds weird. But this is where you shake a baby so hard that you cause serious head injury. Now, today we're not sure that this is as prevalent as it was when we thought it was, like in the 80s and 90s. So there was a nanny here in Boston. She wasn't from Boston. She's from Europe somewhere. And the baby she was caring for died, and it was alleged that it was from shaken baby syndrome. Okay. We don't have accurate data on this. Okay. But between 10 and 12% of deaths are due to abuse and neglect. Or about 10 to 12% of 10 to 12% of deaths are due to abuse and neglect. About 30% of kids who have been shaken this violently will die. Only 15% survive with no lasting effects. This is generally perpetrated by a male parent, often mom's boyfriend. Okay, a few other types of homicides. These are homicides. They're just like specific kinds. So infanticide is when you intentionally kill a child or an infant. Okay, neonaticide is a baby under 24 hours old, and filicide is once a child is more than 24 hours old. It's difficult to get accurate statistics for this. Generally, these kids are killed by a family member, and it's probably 12 to 15% of criminal homicides. Sibling to sibling violence is the most common. It's often overlooked and trivialized. 2/3 of teen siblings had used physical violence to resolve conflicts. Families that have sons experience this more frequently. It is also common within families for an older child. It's not uncommon. For about 40% of teen victims of sexual abuse were younger siblings. They were abused by an older sibling. There's also multi-assaultive families. So this is where, we have these continual cycles of intrafamilial physical aggression and violence. Okay. So this is 7% of all intact families. Men in families in which children and wives are assaulted are 5 times more likely to have assaulted someone outside the family. So like if you're beating on your wife, you're probably beating up other people. There's also child to parent abuse. And I had a client who was doing this, who just scared the hell out of his mother. He would steal stuff from her. And so she would lock up her cigarettes so that he wouldn't get to them. And he would pick the lock just to show her he could get into it. He wouldn't necessarily take the cigarettes, but he wanted her to know that he had control over her. And she was literally counting down the days till he was 18. So in Massachusetts, about 1/3 of restraining orders were requested by parents against their children. 16% of family murder victims are killed by their children. Another case you can look up if you're interested is Alex and Derek King. They're 13 and 14 when they beat their father with a baseball bat and then set the chair he's in on fire. Children who display early chronic forms of aggression and antisocial behavior are more likely to be violent and aggressive towards their parents. We want to nip this kind of behavior in the bud as soon as possible. Okay? Elder abuse affects about 1 out of 10 older adults, but only 1 in 23 incidents are reported, right? Oftentimes the older person who's being victimized is dependent on somebody else to help take care of them. They might be afraid that the person will end up in jail, although their family members are the chief perpetrators. Now, I'm sure you guys know there's a cycle of abuse, right? So the cycle of violence hypothesis or coercion theory says that coercive and punitive tactics in parenting increase the likelihood of later aggressive behavior and potential domestic violence. This is a hot topic of debate, and I have had it with many students where they have said, no, my mom or my dad whipped me, and that's why I am well behaved today. It is not why you're well behaved today. Okay. It is actually putting you at risk to not be well behaved. It also, even if you can get children to comply, they're complying out of fear. They're not internalizing morals or ethics. Okay. Also, children that are victimized or treated improperly while they're children are at further risk of victimization in adulthood.